Thank you everyone for coming to the second design workshop. It's I looks like there's a good retention rate. This is great news. Where I mean I'm assuming that a couple more people will come in a bit, but we'll just get the ball rolling. So, second design workshop. The things we're going to be covering today include slide decks. We're going to be talking a bit about information design, and then we're going to move straight into Adobe Illustrator. So again, if anyone wasn't here in the first workshop, I've been working at Qatar Airways for the past 3 years before coming here. I also was working at Williams Martini F1 Racing, and I have my own startup for design work. It doesn't really matter, but yeah, that's me.
You forgot one.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's okay. Anyway, moving on. So again, I mentioned this last time, but I just want to really tell you guys that all designers are cursed. So if you're planning on becoming a designer, then keep this in mind. You're going to start hating stuff, and it's natural. It's annoying, but it's just a part of life. You're gonna start hating stuff. So yeah. Design is subjective. We also talked about this before. Whatever you hear from one designer is not going to be the same as what you hear from another designer. Everybody thinks differently, and that's perfectly normal. Taste does vary from person to person. And this is a really good example of the Apple Pencil. I just saw it today for the first time, and it wasn't anything special to me. However, to some people it just blew their minds because it's so simple, so efficient, so whatever. I don't like it that much, but other people do. Just one tiny example of how subjective design can be. Right, so the outline for today is we're going to start with a really quick recap of what we did last week. We're going to be going straight into slide deck design. We're going to be talking about information design, how you show information in a much more effective manner, and then we're going to be moving on to Creative Cloud. So workshop number 1, we talked about typography, we talked about serif and sans serif, and you guys can stop me at any point over here if you're confused with the terminology. We talked a bit about colors and how colors contrast with each other. And is that noise coming from inside there?
Welcome to Cornell.
From the other side, yeah. Anyway, kind of annoying, but whatever. So we talked about colors and contrasting colors. We talked about colors that work well together. We looked at vectors and rasters, and this is what we're going to be covering in the second half. We also looked at visual hierarchy, and these are very important when we do any sort of work in design. So you'll notice a lot of this as we move through our slides today. Slide deck design. It's all about expressing your ideas in the most efficient way, right? I love Keynote for slide deck design. I always use Keynote. I hate PowerPoint. Not so much anymore. They've improved a bit, but I don't like Prezi either, if any of you have heard of Prezi. I definitely do not like Google Slides, but they are improving. The reason I like Keynote so much is, one, because for designers it just makes everything so much easier. When you want to lay things out, it's very easy. When you want to create master slides that help you position everything across all your slides, when you're working with 50 plus slides, as I usually do, it makes your job much easier to manage. With that in mind, let's move straight forward. Another reason I like Keynote is because of all the kind of fancy transitions it got, but don't ever overuse them. Typography, right? So we talked about this briefly previously, but keep in mind that using flair is something that you probably should not do, and if you do, use it sparingly. What you want is you want to have one style throughout your you want to keep it consistent. You want to have one style for your headings, you want to have one style for your body. If you do want to have more style using some sort of emphasis, we'll talk about that later, but try to stay away from using bold text, using italics. There are better ways to do that when you're working on slides, right? Sans serif fonts work better, especially for a couple of reasons. Number one, I guess you all know that we should try and stick to like less text on slides, and so I didn't mention it here. Less text on slides, and so you know that sans serif is usually used for more text, and also for high resolution displays. When we're talking about a display like this, it's really easy to see all the pixels, all those little details, which makes serif fonts not so not display as well, right? All caps headings are in right now. That's another thing you should look at. So like, for example, in my slides, you'll notice that the headings are always in capital and everything else is, normal. It's kind of a cool thing, but it's one of those trends that, maybe 2 years down the line I won't be doing. So keep that in mind. When we're talking about color, this is what I use for emphasis, right? So when you're working with color, keep in mind that you want high contrast, okay? So you want high contrast, you want dark backgrounds on bright text. I'll talk about why we're gonna do this later, but this is, it gives a much more serious approach. It gives a much easier to read feeling as well, right? And I use color for emphasis. I would recommend you guys do that as well. It works a lot better than using bold, specifically because if you guys remember from visual hierarchy, bold is something that's obviously a lot more heavy, and it's something that your eyes are going to be drawn to. So if, for example, I put backgrounds on this slide in bold, that's the first thing you're going to see. And it gets kind of annoying when you're going through a slide which you're trying to traverse through while I'm talking as well, right? So that's why try and stay away from bold. And italics are only used for when you want to emphasize something, but within a sentence, right? Or within a line of text. And again, it doesn't do a good job of emphasizing that as much anyway, because of the fact that there aren't that many lines to look through. So try and use color. It's a nice way to add a little bit of extra flair. So I usually have dark background slides, white text, and then maybe 1 or 2 shades of various colors. So like in this case is blue, and this is probably the only slide where I have actual color on text.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you remember the name of that font?
The name of this font, Existence Light. This is my favorite font. So everybody, I guess this applies to any sort of specialization. Everybody has something that they use all the time. So for example, I know Sam's an iOS developer. He likes to do stuff in iOS. Everybody has this kind of specialty or something that they're really good at. I personally am very comfortable using this font. I know how it works. I know how to use it, and so keep that in mind. You might find this one font that you really like, and you want to use it everywhere, and that's perfectly fine as long as you know how to play it well. Visual hierarchy, we talked about this earlier as well, and it's important to know how these tools work with you or against you in cases like this. So you guys all remember this, I'm assuming. You kind of notice the you will first, just because it's right in the middle and it's really big, right? So with visual hierarchy, usually when we're talking about slides, there's a little bit of usage of visual hierarchy, but what ends up happening is more people misuse visual hierarchy than actually use it, right? And that's kind of just because of the fact that you're given a constrained space, and because of that, people unknowingly use some form of visual hierarchy that doesn't actually work in their favor, right? So keep in mind not to let your headings overpower the rest of your slide. You don't want big, bold text that will distract your user from the actual body of your text. Don't let images overpower your text either. So if you do use images, I personally don't, but I know a lot of people who do. Either if you've got a very high contrasting image, then put some sort of filter on top of it that lowers the contrast or something of that sort, so that it doesn't catch the user's eye. Um, Again, like I said before, don't use bold or italics. For emphasis, use color instead, just because of how it applies into your visual hierarchy. You don't want to overdo it. Yeah.
What about icons? I mean, shouldn't icons play as much of a role as images?
Absolutely, absolutely. I personally don't like to use icons, but a lot of people do, and that's perfectly fine. So just like how I was telling Monica earlier, everybody has their own special way of doing things. I personally don't use icons, but they're very, very helpful, and we'll talk a bit about them when we talk about information design, because that's where they come in a lot more useful than over here. But they do play a big role in visual hierarchy, right? Layout. When we're talking about layout, I personally like to do things in a kind of column format, just because when we're working on these projectors here, and a lot of screens nowadays, they're widescreen format, and when you're working with widescreen, it's you have a lot more horizontal space than you have vertical space, and then it just makes sense to divide it up into columns. So a lot of my slides, kind of have this one column for the heading, one column for the actual body, and that changes from slide to slide. So you'll see a couple of different formats that I use throughout this presentation. I like to left align rather than center align, and again, that's because of it just makes your content look cleaner. When you have, for example, a heading on the top or on the side, wherever you decide to put it, you want the place the heading starts to be at the same exact place on every single slide, right? That's very important, because if I'm reading your heading, and let's say your first heading is team, so team's like a very short word, and if you're using a center alignment, your team would come like right in the middle of your slide, and then your next slide says something like something much longer, like, I don't know, the story or something of that sort. So because of that, because of team, people's eyes are directed towards the center of your screen, and then when you have a longer heading, they're directed more towards the left, and it's just kind of annoying. It makes it easier if all your content starts from the same exact place, right? If you're doing this, two-column layout thing just like I am, then think about using a vertically middle alignment. It's also called center alignment, but I just didn't want to use the word center twice. So if you keep it in the middle, it just kind of looks better than if you have something in the corner and then you have like a giant empty space under it. Yeah.
I know we're focusing on slides specifically, but how do you feel about like alignment in like applications or things like that, like iPhone apps?
Alignment in what?
iPhone apps?
iPhone apps?
Yeah. Because you have like buttons there, you have like more things.
So what I try to do is, how when you're working with text, there's this justified thing, which kind of takes the space of the entire width. So I kind of like doing that, where if you just have one button, it kind of takes the entire width, whereas if you have two buttons, they kind of divide between your page. And it depends a lot on the context. So some buttons will have to be on the right side. This is the right side. Yeah. Some buttons will have to be on the right side. Some will have to be on the left side, just because of the nature of what they do. But if you don't know, I guess the safest thing is to kind of justify it and make it take the whole width. Just because when you're working on an iPhone, you don't have that much to work with anyway, so it wouldn't really matter if it takes up the entire width. When you're working with slides, try not to put so much information in them that you inadvertently have to turn around and read them, right? You might need to do it sometimes. Let's say you have a quotation from, a book, which I had last time, where it's something that I want to actually get people to read. But generally speaking, you want enough information on there so that you actually think, okay, I just looked at it for a second and now I know exactly what to say, right? That's kind of what we're looking for over here. And if you've got that right, then you're gonna do what we did in class. You're gonna connect with the people rather than with the slides, which is what my mistake was when I was presenting over there, right? So yeah, that's kind of the point you need to really drive home with all the stuff we talked about right now. Animations is something that a lot of people, like doing in their presentations. I'm not a huge fan of animations, but I do use them sometimes because they kind of imply something every single time you use it, So there are a couple of animations that are kind of prominent in Keynote. That doesn't mean you should use them. Definitely stay away from using some of these. So, some of them are really nice, some of them not so much, okay? So this is one of my favorites, Trace. I've only used it once because...
Can you do that again?
Sorry?
Can you do that again? I missed it.
Yeah, sure. Let's see if I can figure out how to do that. Okay.
Alright.
Now we have to go through the whole thing then. Come on, man. Okay. So fireworks, confetti, fade, and trace. It's kind of cool. It looks really cool when you're working with kind of a paragraph of text. But again, these are the things that only work on Keynote. So no more Google Slides, no more PowerPoint. If you guys have Macs, you got to use Keynote. It's like a free software, and it does so much cool stuff for you. Another one, which I really like, but there's not much use for it, is Anvil. It's just really cool. Anvil. It's brilliant. But the only time, so obviously the Apple keynotes that they do twice a year are done in Apple Keynote. What do you know? And they usually use Anvil when they want to, get this one point across. That's just probably one ginormous number or something of that sort. Like, we had 1 million iPad sales in the past 2 days or something of that sort. So that's when they use this. I don't know when it would ever be useful in a professional setting, but if you do find a use for it, please let me know so that I can use it in my slides as well. 10-20-30 rule. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but it's something that Guy Kawasaki kind of lives by. Do you guys know Guy Kawasaki? Okay, so I'm seeing some yeses and nos. Guy Kawasaki, can somebody? Okay, Karan, you nodded your head the most. So do you want to explain?
I don't know. He's a serial entrepreneur, I guess. Very opinionated, very good opinions of.
Yeah. So he was working for Yahoo for a while, and then now he does his own entrepreneurship thing.
He also worked for Apple.
He also worked for Apple for a bit. Yeah. So he does a lot of stuff on, helping people figure out how to market themselves and stuff. And one thing which he usually says, which I kind of like, is the 10-20-30 rule. And this applies to people who are giving pitch presentations mainly, right? So you have 10 slides, and if you Google it, it tells you exactly what each slide should say. So there's a slide for, an introduction, a slide for team, a slide for, financial projections, and so on, just 10 slides. You talk about them for 20 minutes, only 20 minutes. Even if you have an hour's time with your investor, you only talk for 20 minutes. Why is this? Because one, people will obviously be running late to your talk. People will have to leave earlier as well, generally speaking. And a lot of times people wouldn't be able to pay attention for more than 20 minutes. But most importantly, it gives enough time for your investors to talk to you and discuss afterwards. And especially if they want to say something in between, it gives them enough time to do that as well. 30-point font is the last thing. Basically, keep things big so that one, it restricts you from writing too much, and two, it's easy to see all the way from the back of the room as well. And the other thing that helps with this is the 2-column layout, which is what I stick to. The reason I say that is because of your 2-column layout, you're already restricted to how much space you have for your text, and that makes you limit how much you write as well. So in this case, just to give you context, this is 58 point font, right? So this is huge. If you go below 30 points, nobody will ever be able to read what it says unless they have like printouts right in front of them. Okay, so just for reference, I prefer to use much larger than 30 point, but it also depends on the font you're using. For some fonts, 30 is much bigger than for other fonts, right? So keep all those in mind. The last kind of thing I want to talk about when we're talking about slides is you kind of have to deal with what you've got, right? So that whole "when life gives you lemons" phrase kind of works with everything, right? So in this context, it's really a lot about studying the place you're in, studying the people you're talking to, and all of that sort of stuff, right? So keep all these in mind, and I'll dive into a bit of detail with one thing specifically, and that's display technology, right? And this is something that we kind of don't really take into consideration when we're designing slides, but it's something you really should, right? So take into consideration where exactly you're designing it and for which type of technology, right? So first of all, you've got projector displays, right? So projector displays are lower resolution and contrast, and because of this, the slides that you produce are generally not going to look like how they do on your computer, right? So you're like, oh my God, this looks so beautiful on my computer, and then you put it over here and it looks ugly, right? And this is kind of what happened a couple of weeks ago when the Bloomberg person came to give a talk, and about machine learning and stuff, and you know how their terminal is like really dark and it's got like blue and orange text. Well, it doesn't show up so great on the projector, and in some cases you see a lot of presenters apologizing that, oh, this isn't how it looked, like this isn't how it's supposed to look. And to be honest, I do that as well sometimes, but this is one thing for all of us to keep in mind, right? So high contrast images and text, offset this problem, right? So that's number one. And the whole serif fonts thing, if you use serif fonts and you're using it on a low resolution screen, then it looks a lot more choppy, right? So keep these things in mind. When you're presenting on a projector, one common thing is people kind of walk across the projector, and sometimes you see a shadow where my head is. Because of this, what you don't want to do is use too bright colors or put text at a place where somebody's head might be, right? And so that really depends on which room you're in, what sort of setting you're in. Because over here, the projector comes down to here, but in some places it's much higher, some places it starts from the ground. So all of these are things you need to keep into consideration. Why is that? It's because if I'm standing over here, one, light is shining into my eye, two, you kind of see, it just looks really, really weird, right? You see me kind of wearing a hat or something, and you see my shadow on the screen. So there's no way it works in any case. And last of all, everyone's getting bright light in their eyes, and it makes it less readable, right? So compare the readability on these two slides, and you'll kind of notice the difference, right? So it may be very, very tiny, but it does kind of make a difference, right? So if I'm using a dark display, I can use really, really thin fonts, which I like to do. Whereas if I'm using a white background, I need to use thicker fonts in order for them to be just as readable. Next up, LED screens and monitors. These are more expensive, which means they're less common. So we have them at Fozzy, and pretty much that's it, right? They have higher resolution. They have higher contrast, which allows for more flexibility. You can use images which have a lot more color in them. You can use a lot more. You can get a lot more creative with your text, mainly because it'll look exactly how it does on your screen, right? So that's a plus point for LED screens and monitors, but they're less common. Again, this is why you need to kind of know where you're presenting, what you're presenting on. the other big thing with these, or the other small thing with these, are they actually end up being smaller than projectors, right? So because they're smaller, if you notice the screen in Fuzzy, like LED screens aren't larger than 80 or 90 inches wide, right? And this is already like 100 and something. And so because of this, things would probably need to be slightly bigger. So the fonts you're using and all those things need to be slightly bigger. And again, you don't want to use a white background over here for a very different reason, because when you've got a backlit screen, it's a lot brighter on your audience when you're using a white background. So if you use a white background there and somebody dims the light or something, that's it, everyone's blinded. Paper handouts, I highly do not recommend using your slides as paper handouts, mainly because if you do a good job at making slides, which are more like cue cards, which are more like things that require a presenter to be present, then that basically means that by themselves they're pretty much useless, right? If you want to give your potential investor, if you want to give a potential partner information about your company, the last thing you want to do is give them a slide deck that you're not presenting, right? Because one, if there are things that are missing that you had to fill in, they're probably going to assume, or they're probably going to, fill in the gaps with their own knowledge, right? So there's no situation where I see you guys using your slide deck as a paper handout. But if you have to, if there's no other way around it, then use a white background just because you want to save ink, save the planet and stuff. And on top of that, a white background on paper is much more readable than a dark background with white text on paper. Okay, so it's kind of the complete opposite as you would do on a display. Some other things to keep in consideration, when you're working with a scenario like this, is visibility and legibility. Keep in mind, how far people are and how much they can see from that distance. Keep in mind how old they are, because something like this may not work if I have an audience of 60 or 70-year-olds. I've had problems in the past where I made a presentation, or I wrote a document, and my manager's manager was like, I can't read this, it's too small for me, or it just doesn't work for me. So keep that in mind. You got to keep in mind how wide or narrow your room is, right? So over here, everyone's kind of just going down that way. However, if we were in let's say Grizzly, where you have a lot more seats in one row, then that means that maybe designing a 2-column layout doesn't work so well, because if I'm sitting on this side of the room, I get a very different view from if I'm sitting on this side of the room, right? So that's one thing to keep in consideration, and how attentive your audience actually is, right? So in certain situations, your audience wants to be there, wants to see you present, but in other situations, they actually don't want to be there. They're like forced to be there, or they're just in a situation where they're like, oh my God, I've had such a long day, and now I have to sit through this Zayed guy who's going to talk for like 2 hours or whatever. So keep in mind how attentive they are, and based on that, you would add bits of like attention-grabbing stuff, to keep them engaged, right? I forget the slide. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for slide design. We're gonna move quickly into information design, and this is a lot about expressing your numbers so that they convey what ideas you're trying to convey, right? So that's what information design is a lot about, right? So this is a really good book if you guys are interested in a new reading for your subway ride or something. The Visual Display of Quantitative Information by Edward Tufte. He is really famous for his information design stuff. This is just one example of his work. This is I'm not sure who exactly this was, but yeah.
So what's the name of the book?
Edward Tufte.
Yeah, the name, sorry. Visual.
The name of the book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. Yeah.
I remember.
'Cause, yeah. I remember. 'Cause, yeah. 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 'C So this is a graph, I would say, or a chart of that shows a lot of information in a very little amount of space, right? So what he's trying to convey is how there's an army. Unfortunately it's not written in English, but
Napoleon.
Poland.
I think it's Napoleon going into Russia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's Napoleon going to Russia. I studied about this a long time ago, but kind of forgot. But yeah, so basically what he's trying to show is, one, he's got a map of the area, but on overlaid on the map is kind of this line, which seems to be getting narrower and narrower, and it's the width of this line actually represents the size of the army that was with him at that point, right? So what you can see is from over here, a couple of people went up there, and you can see slowly and slowly the size of the army is decreasing, and this is because people were either passing away during the trip. Some people may have just deserted the army or something, but mainly it's just a really incredible way of showing that showing that much information in this much space. So you can see over here, this many people had left, for this trip, and the black line shows how many people came back, and it's just really, really powerful. The way you can use information design to show massive amounts of data in very, very little space. It's brilliant. So we'll move into a couple of different forms of visual information. So this is a pie chart. Pie charts are mainly used for, to display parts of a whole. They're used to display proportions. So the whole pie chart represents obviously the total. So in this case, things that taught me that life is unfair. So, parents taught me life is unfair, school taught me sports, and Mario Kart basically taught me that life is really unfair. It kind of shows how, the entire thing is how many different things taught this person that life is unfair, right? And each of them, rather than representing a single instance, they represent a percentage. And that's very important for you to understand how to use, pie charts, right? And you can actually combine pie charts into what I call stacked pie charts to show proportions over a certain other another parameter. So in this case, what this chart actually shows, which is kind of funny because of what it looks like, it's a visualization of internet browser usage over time. So over here, the innermost circle represents January 2002, and the outermost circle represents August 2009. And it's an indication of, what different types of browsers people were using over those times. So for example, the blue ones are kind of different versions of Internet Explorer. The orange ones are Firefox, which is kind of funny because now it kind of looks like a Firefox logo. And this kind of shows how you can, kind of manipulate your data to show certain things, right? If this person kind of just, instead of using a pie chart, stacked pie charts, if he just kind of expanded it into bar charts or something, it wouldn't be as relevant, or it wouldn't show the same kind of information, right? Bar charts and histograms are used to show volume, where we talked about pie charts showing percentage or showing proportion. Bar charts are usually used to show volume, right? So so this is a graph of the hours that I slept last week, right? And so every bar obviously just represents the number of hours I slept that day, right? A histogram, I don't know if you guys have heard of histograms or not, some people are nodding their heads, is basically, instead of showing volume, it shows frequency. So for example, if I had to convert this into a histogram, it would be how many times I slept for 6 hours within a certain time frame, how many times I slept for 7 hours, and so on. So that's what a histogram is. And when we talk about bell curves and grading on a curve, that's usually a histogram rather than a regular bar chart. Line graphs, these are well, the other important thing to note over here, that this is for discontinuous data, right? So in this data, especially if you look at the hours I slept last week, it's a lot about like, I slept for 6 hours tonight, and then I woke up, and then I slept for 7 hours tomorrow night, and then I woke up, and so on, right? So they're discontinuous. Whereas when we talk about a line graph is a display of continuous information, right? So information that kind of continues over time, in this case. So in this case, it's steps I walked last week. So it's kind of something that you'd also expect to be shown in a bar chart. A lot of people think of this stuff to be shown in a bar chart as well. But when you have continuous information, so for another example is the stock market. When you're showing stocks, that's why they show them as line graphs rather than bars, right? What they do show in more advanced financial software as bars are the number of stocks that are traded. So those are discontinuous data. So today there were 35,000 stocks traded. Tomorrow there are 50,000 or something. So that's where the difference is, right? And a lot of people get think they're interchangeable, but they're definitely not. They both show different types of information, and you should use them accordingly. Qualitative charts. I did not know how else to describe this, but this is a very common way of showing information that designers use. And you may have noticed that this is what we did for company challenges. It was measuring impact and complexity on two different scales, which are generally very abstract terms, but if you can visualize them like this, they kind of show a lot more information than they would otherwise, right? So a lot of times these are arbitrary metrics. They're metrics that you come up with, and they help you to display a bunch of different things. So in the case of company challenges, we're displaying our various different solutions that we could go across using a chart like this. So you could use them in pretty much any context where you want to sort through a couple of different things, a couple of different categories. That's pretty much where you would use this. So it's a very good way to display stuff when the only other option would be to like write them down as bullet points, right? So what we're trying to do with information design is trying to move away from just text and make it more visual. And so this is a great way to visualize stuff that you wouldn't otherwise visualize. Play numbers are also something that are usually written as bullet forms, but I would recommend against doing that. This is kind of basically a recap of, or kind of a look at the design workshops that we've been doing until now. So through the survey, we've got like 71 survey responses. 52 attendees showed up last time. 26 members on the #DesignWorkshops Slack channel. So whoever's in here, please add yourself to it tonight. Until now, I have presented a total of 132 slides. It doesn't seem like that, like I presented that much, but I have a lot of slides and very little information on each slide. And the last kind of thing is 0 people actually did the homework that I assigned last week. So, just do it, guys. Yeah.
Hey, what was the homework?
What, the Slack channel?
No,
The homework?
Yeah.
Oh, the homework was pretty much just write a sentence or two about any object or any app or pretty much anything. Just give your critique about it. So say I don't like that door handle. That would be my critique, and that's it. So can't believe 0 people did it. Right. So this is an example of where I've used information design in my previous work. So I wouldn't use a white slide, in this presentation, but the place where I was presenting, it turned out that a white slide worked much better in that specific scenario, right? So here I'm displaying a bunch of different, single number data points. Yeah.
Why did white work better in that scenario?
Sorry?
Why did white work better in that scenario?
In that scenario, why did white work better? Because it was a one-to-one presentation where I was presenting to a manager of the company I was working at, and yeah, so I was presenting to a manager of the company I was working at, and I was just using my own laptop. So in an office setting, I was using my own laptop, and it just kind of worked better in that specific scenario. And also, I thought that at the end of the whole talk, he would want a paper handout of what I presented. And that's kind of common as well. Sometimes people ask for the slide deck. And so if you're prepared for that, then you might be using a white background slide instead. Yeah.
For those visual things, you had like Napoleon's, that war, and the other one that looked like Firefox. Are there tools for that? Or is
Yes.
it all Photoshop that's
So the first one, I don't think there was a tool for that, because that was just, he just kind of drew that out himself. A while back, I think it was probably even before Photoshop and stuff. But the Firefox one, there is, and I will link you guys to it at the end of this. So there's a specific framework that did that visualization. So I'll link you guys. And I personally use Adobe Illustrator for that stuff as well. So you can draw graphs and charts and stuff. And you'll see another one from me later on. But I prefer using Adobe Illustrator to draw these things, because you get a lot more control. But in any case, Keynote also gives you a lot of control over these things. Another form is a timeline, and this is usually these kind of represent Gantt chart-like things, and they're things that not many people think about presenting in this kind of format. But I personally like showing stuff in this format just because it makes it very, very clear to whoever I'm presenting what exactly happened. So again, so the last thing I said over here is, it's really better for people who have a stake in what you built, because it shows a lot more details. So it's similar to that, remember that journey thing that we did in class where you have this kind of that thing, as Karen greatly puts it. I don't know how to put it better, so good job. So this kind of gives you a lot more detail, and it depends on whether or not who you're talking to wants that much detail. So this is for the timeline for the work that I did at the airport, as I've probably mentioned many times in the past, but this is kind of how we did it. So I kind of ran my manager through what exactly we did over the course of that period of time. So in each of these places, I'd be like, this was a creation phase, this is what we did. Then we set up the business rules. And then in September, we started the branding introduction, and we ended branding, somewhere in February. And then at the very end came the implementation phase, which kind of overran with the branding phase. So I kind of had it much more rehearsed when I presented to my boss. So if you do use animations like this, which kind of does the work for you, keep in mind that you should rehearse how much time it takes to fill that animation up.
So the timeline is something that's in Keynote?
Sorry?
That timeline, like moving, is
Yeah.
something that's in Keynote, or how do you do it?
Yeah, it's in Keynote, but so the moving timeline that you can do in any software, but pretty much all you do is the move animation. It's basically just called move, and you select where your animation starts, so where your object starts, and then where it ends. So I pretty much just dragged it to the other end. So this is the last frame or whatever, and then you set the duration for that. So yeah.
I don't know if this is what Kira meant, but what about the timeline
how did I make? Well, so that was actually I used two different slides. So this is actually interesting. This is one of my favorite animations in Keynote. So this is one slide, okay, and then this is another slide.
But I mean the actual timeline, did you draw it on a different application?
Did I what?
Or did you make it in Keynote, the actual timeline?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm saying. So these are two different slides, and so Keynote has this thing called Magic Move. It's one of the transitions, and what it does is any element that's on the preceding slide, if it's on the second slide, it will magically move it to that other place, and it'll make it grow or shrink as well.
I think he was asking where you made the Gantt chart. How you made the
Oh, this is the other thing I was talking about in Adobe Illustrator. So I did this in Adobe Illustrator. It's just a series of rectangles, and that's pretty much it. Except it's much more easier for me to do it there than use an actual software. Yeah. Now we have to wait for this. Yeah. I wish there was a way to forward animations. Yeah.
I have a question is that in your workshops, I'm gonna do some hands-on stuff. I'm just very curious about. I don't know how many workshops we're gonna have, but are we gonna do some hands? Sorry, my voice is. Are we going to do some hands-on stuff? Like, are we going to like?
Yeah, that's pretty much in about 5 to 10 minutes. Yeah. So so this is. I was kind of showing you guys a bit about like slide deck and information design, and then the last bit of it is actually building stuff, right? So word clusters is another thing that I personally like to use. In this specific case, I was making a presentation on personal branding and why people should think about personal branding, and so all the kind of buzzwords or however you'd like to put it that otherwise, again, you'd put in a bullet form. This is a better way of doing that same exact thing. So we're kind of just trying to give you guys ways to stay away from bullets, right? So think about that as a way of doing things. And yeah, pretty much that sums up the first kind of. Alep, if you were asking, this was a homework from last week, and. I've assigned it again, knowing that pretty much no one's going to do it, but in case somebody does, it would be great for everyone to learn from as well. So that's pretty much the first part of the workshop, and the next